Welcome back to Cafe Stories, where we brew tales as rich as your morning coffee. I'm your host, Alfie, and today we're steeping ourselves in the world of Miss Marple. Now tell me, isn't it wonderful how stories bring us together, no matter where we are in this big world? Before we begin, I'd love to know which corner of the world are you enjoying this story from today? I read every single one. Let's get started. Miss Marple and the Missing Marmalade Recipe. Chapter 1. Morning at St. Mary Mead. Miss Jane Marple was snipping at her roses early that Tuesday morning, a task which gave her particular satisfaction. The morning air was crisp, carrying just the faintest scent of autumn, though the summer still held firmly to St. Mary Mead. Her garden was her pride and joy, and the white roses especially had done rather well this year. "Oh dear," she murmured, as a thorn caught in her glove. "One must always be careful of the thorns, they do hide so cleverly among the prettiest blooms." She straightened up carefully, one hand pressed against the small of her back. At her time of life, gardening did occasionally remind one of one's age. The sound of the garden gate opening caused her to turn. "Morning, miss," called her housekeeper, Mrs. Florence Green, slightly out of breath as she hurried up the garden path. "I've just come from the post office. Such news." Miss Marple smiled indulgently. Mrs. Green was an excellent housekeeper, but she did so enjoy being the bearer of village gossip. "Good morning, Florence. What news has so excited you this morning?" "It's about the village fete on Saturday, miss. Mrs. Price has just announced that Mrs. Hartley will be presenting her famous Marmalade for the Preserve competition. Everyone's talking about it, as she hasn't entered in 3 years, not since her husband passed." "Ah, yes," said Miss Marple, removing her gardening gloves. "Mrs. Hartley's Marmalade. I remember it won first prize 5 years in succession. It has rather a distinctive flavour, bitter oranges, of course, but with just a hint of something else. I've never quite been able to identify it." "That's just it, miss," said Mrs. Green, lowering her voice confidentially. "They say she's guarded that recipe like the crown jewels. Her nephew, Mr. Frederick, has just returned from his travels abroad, and Mrs. Weatherby from the post office says he's been asking after the recipe, says there's a gentleman from London interested in purchasing it." "Indeed?" Miss Marple raised her eyebrows. "How very interesting. I hadn't heard that Frederick had returned to the village. He must be, let me see, nearly 40 now. I recall he was always a rather restless boy." "Just so, miss. Been away in Africa or some such place for years. Mining, they say. Come back looking very tanned and smartly dressed, though Mrs. Weatherby thinks he hasn't done as well as he lets on." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Human nature was much the same everywhere, and she had observed many times how people returning to their origins often felt the need to exaggerate their successes. "Perhaps we might take some tea on the lawn," Miss Marple suggested, gathering her gardening basket. "And you can tell me more about the fete arrangements." Over tea, served in the shade of the old apple tree, Mrs. Green elaborated on the village news. The new doctor, Dr. James Crawford, had agreed to open the fete, though he had been in St. Mary Mead scarcely a month. "Very modern ideas, they say," commented Mrs. Green. "But a pleasant manner. His sister came with him, Miss Margaret Crawford. Rather reserved, she is. Been a research chemist in London, according to Mrs. Price, who had it from the vicar's wife." "Ah, Mrs. Billings," said Miss Marple. "How is dear Helena? I haven't seen her since Sunday service." "Full of plans for the vicarage garden, miss. Very ambitious, she is, always wanting to change things. The Reverend just smiles and lets her get on with it." "Oh, and she's been asking about old recipes too." "Setting up a display for the fete, she says, on culinary traditions of St. Mary Mead." Miss Marple's faded blue eyes showed a flicker of interest. "Has she indeed?" and Mrs. Hartley's marmalade would naturally be of interest for such a display. "That's just what I thought, miss," agreed Mrs. Green. "Though between you and me, Mrs. Hartley wasn't too pleased when approached. Very sharp she was with Mrs. Billings, saying some things aren't meant for public sharing." The conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of the church clock striking 11. Mrs. Green exclaimed at the time and hurried inside to see to the household duties, leaving Miss Marple to her thoughts. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple decided a walk to the village would be pleasant. She was due to change her library book, and perhaps she might see some of the fete preparations in progress. As she approached the village green, she noticed a small gathering outside the post office. Mrs. Hartley herself was there, a thin, upright woman despite her 70-odd years, her white hair neatly arranged beneath a modest hat. Beside her stood a middle-aged man whom Miss Marple recognized, after a moment's consideration, as Frederick Hartley. He had indeed changed considerably. His face was deeply tanned and lined about the eyes, giving him a somewhat weather-beaten appearance despite his clearly expensive suit. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Hartley," said Miss Marple pleasantly, approaching the group. "How nice to see you. I understand we are to have the pleasure of your marmalade at the fete?" Mrs. Hartley's face brightened. "Miss Marple, how do you do?" "Yes, indeed. One must support the village traditions after all. You remember my nephew, Frederick?" Frederick turned, revealing a smile that Miss Marple found not quite reached his eyes. "Miss Marple," he said, taking her hand, "I doubt you'd remember me. It's been nearly 15 years. "Of course I remember you, Mr. Hartley," replied Miss Marple, gently. "You once helped me recover my cat when she had climbed the old oak by the church. Most kind of you." Something like genuine surprise flickered across his face. "Did I? I'm afraid I don't recall." "Young boys often do kind things without remembering them," said Miss Marple. "You've been travelling abroad, I understand." "East Africa," he replied. "Mining interests, only just sorted out. Thought it was time to come home and see how Aunt Edith was getting on." Mrs. Hartley patted his arm affectionately. "Just in time to help me with the fete. Frederick has business sense, you know. Says my marmalade could be worth something." At that moment, Dr. Crawford and his sister passed by, pausing to greet the group. The doctor was a pleasant-looking man of about 45, with an open countenance and friendly manner. His sister, by contrast, seemed somewhat tense, her smile not quite natural as introductions were made. "Miss Crawford," said Mrs. Hartley, "I understand you were once involved in chemistry research." "How fascinating." Miss Crawford's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Yes, industrial applications mainly. Nothing very exciting, I'm afraid." "On the contrary," said the vicar's wife, Mrs. Billings, who had just joined the group with an armful of papers that appeared to be fate notices. "I find it all most interesting. Perhaps you might advise me on the preservation of documents for my display." Miss Crawford looked distinctly uncomfortable. "I'm afraid that wasn't my area at all." Miss Marple observed the exchange with interest, noting how Frederick Hartley's attention had sharpened at the mention of documents, and how his eyes followed Miss Crawford with particular intensity. "Mrs. Hartley," said Mrs. Billings, turning to the older woman, "I do hope you've reconsidered allowing me to include your recipe in the display. Such a vital part of village tradition." "I'm afraid not," said Mrs. Hartley, firmly. "Some things should remain private. Family matters, you understand?" "But surely," began Mrs. Billings. "My aunt has made her position clear," Frederick interrupted smoothly. "The recipe remains private, though the marmalade itself will certainly be enjoyed at the fete." As the group dispersed, Miss Marple continued on her way to the library, thoughtfully considering the tensions she had observed. Human nature was indeed much the same everywhere, and she was reminded rather forcefully of the case of the verger's missing hymnals some years ago. people could become so very peculiar about items that others might consider trivial. She had no way of knowing, of course, that within 5 days the seemingly trivial matter of a marmalade recipe would be connected to not one but 2 deaths in the quiet village of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 2. Commotion at the Fête. Saturday morning dawned bright and clear, much to the relief of Mrs. Mavis Price, who had been worrying about the weather for the village fête for the better part of a week. Miss Marple observed the proceedings from her usual vantage point beneath the large oak tree on the vicarage lawn, her knitting needles clicking steadily as she worked on a pale blue baby's jacket for her grandniece. The fête had been arranged with the customary English thoroughness. White marquees dotted the vicarage garden, bunting fluttered in the gentle breeze, and the Women's Institute tea tent was doing a brisk trade. The preserve judging was scheduled for 11 o'clock in the small tent adjacent to the flower display, and Miss Marple noted with interest the careful way in which Mrs. Hartley carried her contribution, a jar of golden marmalade gleaming like amber in the morning sunlight. "Good morning, Miss Marple," said Reverend Billings, pausing beside her chair. "A perfect day for our little celebration, wouldn't you say?" "Indeed, Vicar," she replied with a smile. "The garden is looking particularly lovely. Mrs. Billings must have worked very hard." "Helena does throw herself into these things with great enthusiasm," he agreed, glancing fondly toward his wife, who was arranging display boards near the preserve tent. "Her historical display has been quite the undertaking. She was rather disappointed not to include Mrs. Hartley's famous recipe, but one must respect people's privacy in such matters." Miss Marple nodded, but before she could respond, Dr. Crawford approached them, his sister a few paces behind. "Good morning, Vicar, Miss Marple," he said cheerfully. "Quite the gathering, isn't it?" "I feel quite honoured to have been asked to open proceedings, especially as such a new arrival." "We're delighted to welcome you to the community, Doctor," said the vicar warmly. "And you too, Miss Crawford. I understand you've agreed to judge the children's science competition?" Miss Crawford's smile seemed somewhat forced. "Yes, though I fear my expertise may be exaggerated. Industrial chemistry is rather different from baking soda volcanoes." "Oh, I'm sure you'll manage admirably," said Miss Marple. "Children so appreciate being taken seriously. I noticed you examining Mrs. Billings' display earlier. Are you interested in local history?" Something flickered in Miss Crawford's eyes. "One tries to learn about one's new home, of course. Excuse me, I believe they're waiting for me." As she hurried away, Miss Marple's gaze followed her thoughtfully. The morning progressed pleasantly, with Dr. Crawford performing the opening ceremony with appropriate brevity before the competitions began in earnest. Miss Marple made her way slowly toward the preserve tent, where a small crowd had gathered for the judging. Mrs. Hartley stood rather proudly beside her entry, her recipe book, a worn leather-bound volume, tucked under her arm. Frederick Hartley hovered nearby, engaged in conversation with the doctor, though Miss Marple noticed his eyes frequently darted toward his aunt and her book. Mrs. Billings was also there, ostensibly arranging her display of culinary traditions. But Miss Marple observed how her attention too seemed fixed on Mrs. Hartley's movements. The judge, Mrs. Bantry, from Gossington Hall, was working her way methodically through the entries when a commotion from the tea tent momentarily drew everyone's attention. It was nothing more than a child overturning a lemonade jug, but in that brief moment of distraction, Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Hartley place her recipe book on a small table before moving to assist with the clean-up. When Mrs. Hartley returned some minutes later, her face suddenly changed. "My book!" she exclaimed, looking around in confusion. "My recipe book! It was right here." The small crowd turned to look. The table was indeed empty. "Perhaps you moved it, Aunt Edith," suggested Frederick quickly at her side. "Or someone has put it somewhere for safekeeping." "I did no such thing. said Mrs. Hartley sharply. "I left it right here when I went to help with that child's mess. Someone has taken it." Mrs. Price hurried over. "Now, Mrs. Hartley, I'm sure it's just been misplaced. Let's all have a look around." A search of the immediate area revealed nothing, and Mrs. Hartley's distress grew visibly. "That book contains all my recipes collected over 50 years. The marmalade recipe was my mother's before me." Miss Marple observed the reactions of those present with interest. Frederick's concern seemed genuine enough, though there was something in his expression, a tightness around the eyes, that suggested additional worries beyond the loss of a family heirloom. Dr. Crawford offered measured sympathy, while his sister hung back, her face carefully blank. Mrs. Billings displayed great energy in organizing the search, though Miss Marple noted she confined her efforts to areas already examined by others. "Should we notify the police, Mrs. Hartley?" asked the vicar tentatively. Mrs. Hartley drew herself up. "Certainly not. I have no wish to disrupt the fate with police involvement. It's just a family matter after all." Her voice softened slightly. "Though I would ask anyone who finds it to return it promptly. Some things are quite irreplaceable." The judging continued, though with a subdued atmosphere. Mrs. Hartley's marmalade was awarded first prize, but she accepted the small silver cup with little of her usual pleasure, and soon after made her excuses to leave. Frederick escorted his aunt home, but returned to the fete within the hour, and Miss Marple observed him moving methodically among the tents, his eyes scanning the ground and tables with careful attention. He paused near Mrs. Billings's display, examining it with what appeared to casual observers as polite interest, but what Miss Marple recognized as carefully controlled intensity. "A shame about Mrs. Hartley's book," said Mrs. Bantry, settling herself beside Miss Marple with a cup of tea. "Though I must say, it seems an odd thing to bring to the fete at all. I never carry my recipes about, too afraid of losing them." "Yes," agreed Miss Marple. "It did seem rather unnecessary, unless, of course, she wished to refer to it for some reason." "Or to show it to someone," suggested Mrs. Bantry. "I had the impression she was rather proud of it. Kept it very close until that little accident." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "It reminds me rather of Mrs. Elkins and her grandmother's pearl necklace. She would wear it to every event, you know, until the clasp broke at the harvest festival and one of the pearls was lost. Such a commotion. And in the end it turned out that—" She stopped, noticing something across the lawn. "How very interesting." Miss Crawford was standing by the edge of the vicarage garden, partially concealed by a rhododendron bush, deep in conversation with a man Miss Marple did not recognize, a tall, distinguished-looking gentleman who was certainly not from the village. As Miss Marple watched, Miss Crawford glanced around nervously before handing the man what appeared to be a small parcel. "What is it?" asked Mrs. Bantry, following her gaze, but by then Miss Crawford and the stranger had parted ways, the man walking briskly toward the village lane, Miss Crawford returning to the fete with an expression of careful composure. "Nothing of importance, I'm sure," said Miss Marple, mildly. "Just thinking about Mrs. Hartley's recipe book. Such a pity to lose a family treasure." She picked up her knitting once more, her needles resuming their steady rhythm. "Though in my experience things often have a way of turning up, sometimes in the most unexpected places." She could not have known then how prophetic her words would prove, nor that the missing recipe book would soon be the least of Mrs. Hartley's concerns. For as the village of St. Mary Mead enjoyed the remainder of their summer fete, forces had been set in motion that would lead, 3 days later, to the discovery of a body in a pantry, and the beginning of a mystery that only Miss Jane Marple would be able to unravel. Chapter 3. A Body in the Pantry. Tuesday morning in St. Mary Mead began much like any other. Miss Marple was in her garden again, this time deadheading the dahlias, when she heard the unmistakable sound, of an ambulance siren. In a village as small as St. Mary Mead, such a sound invariably drew attention, and Miss Marple straightened, her secateurs paused mid-snip as she listened. The siren grew louder, then stopped. Not too far away, she thought. Perhaps on Elm Street. Mrs. Green appeared at the garden gate before Miss Marple had time to wonder further. "Oh, Miss Marple," she called, breathless with excitement and distress. "Such terrible news! It's Mrs. Hartley. Found dead in her pantry, she was, not half an hour ago by young Alice, who does for her mornings." Miss Marple's faded blue eyes widened slightly. "Dear me," she said quietly. "How very sad. Was it her heart, do you think? Mrs. Hartley was not young, of course?" "That's what Dr. Crawford said when he came. Natural causes, heart most likely, though there'll have to be a proper examination, him being new to her case. But there's something odd about it all, if you ask me." Mrs. Green lowered her voice confidentially. "Alice says she was on the floor with jars all around her, as if she'd been reaching for something on the top shelf and had a turn. But Mrs. Price, who spoke to Alice directly, says Mrs. Hartley never kept anything important up high on account of her arthritis." "Indeed?" Miss Marple murmured, her mind working. "And her cat, Martha, isn't it? Was she there?" Mrs. Green looked puzzled by the question. "No mention of the cat, miss. Though now you mention it, Mrs. Hartley was very fond of that animal. Never went anywhere without Martha following along." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "I believe I might walk down to the village. One should express one's condolences to Frederick, after all." The village was humming with the news. Small groups of people stood conversing in the high street, their voices hushed but animated. The ambulance was gone by the time Miss Marple reached Mrs. Hartley's cottage, a neat, whitewashed building with a well-tended front garden. The police car parked outside, however, suggested official matters were still in progress. Inspector Slack, whom Miss Marple had encountered in previous investigations, emerged from the cottage looking harassed as she approached. He was a man who prided himself on efficiency and had little patience for what he considered interference. "Good morning, Inspector," said Miss Marple pleasantly. Inspector Slack's expression suggested he found nothing good about the morning. "Miss Marple," he acknowledged curtly. "If you've come to see Mr. Hartley, I'm afraid this isn't a convenient time." "Oh, I quite understand," she replied. "Such a sad business. I merely wished to express my condolences when appropriate. I understand poor Mrs. Hartley suffered a heart attack." "That appears to be the case," said the inspector, his tone suggesting he had no intention of discussing details. "Dr. Crawford's preliminary assessment points to natural causes, age-related, nothing suspicious." "I see," said Miss Marple, "though it does remind me rather of the case of the verger's missing hymnal some years ago. Mr. Beddoes was found at the foot of the church steps, you know, and everyone supposed he had simply fallen, but it turned out—" "I'm quite sure this is nothing like that," interrupted Inspector Slack. "Mrs. Hartley was 76 years old and had a history of heart problems according to her nephew." "I wasn't aware Frederick knew much about his aunt's health," Miss Marple remarked mildly. "He's been abroad for so many years." Inspector Slack frowned. "They corresponded regularly, he says. Now, if you'll excuse me." At that moment, Frederick Hartley himself appeared at the cottage door. He looked pale, but composed, his manner subdued. "Miss Marple," he said, noticing her. "How kind of you to call." "I won't intrude," she said gently. "I merely wanted to express my sympathies." Frederick nodded. "Thank you. It was quite a shock, though, at her age." He trailed off, then seemed to collect himself. "Inspector, I found that notepad you asked about, and it was in the sitting room, not the kitchen." Miss Marple's interest was piqued, but she knew better than to ask directly. Instead, she remarked, "Your aunt was so organized, I'm sure she left everything in good order." A slight frown crossed Frederick's face. "Not entirely. There's a half-written note. Shopping list, I think. but I can't make out the last item, and I still haven't located her recipe book. She was quite concerned about it after the fête, you know." "Perhaps I might help," offered Miss Marple. "Sometimes an old woman's eyes see things differently." Before Frederick could respond, Inspector Slack cut in firmly. "That won't be necessary, Miss Marple. This is a police matter, routine though it may be." Miss Marple accepted the dismissal with good grace and continued her walk toward the village shop, her mind turning over the details she had gathered. The missing cat troubled her particularly. Mrs. Hartley had been devoted to Martha, and the animal was known to be exceptionally attached to its mistress. As she rounded the corner by the post office, she encountered Miss Crawford, who appeared to be in a hurry. "Good morning," said Miss Marple. "Such sad news about Mrs. Hartley." Miss Crawford started slightly. "Yes, dreadful, though I hardly knew her, of course." "Dr. Crawford attended to her, I understand?" "James was called, yes." "A heart attack, quite straightforward." Miss Crawford glanced at her watch. "Excuse me, I have an appointment." Miss Marple watched her hurry away, noting the tension in her shoulders. Continuing toward the shop, she was hailed by Mrs. Billings, who was emerging with a basket of groceries. "Miss Marple, have you heard the terrible news? Poor Mrs. Hartley." "Yes, indeed," said Miss Marple, "and most distressing. I understand there was some confusion in the pantry, jars displaced and such." Mrs. Billings' eyes lit with the spark that often accompanies those who relish sharing details of a tragedy. Alice was quite distraught when she found her, said there were empty spaces on the pantry shelves, as if several jars had been removed. And a curious thing, Mrs. Hartley was clutching a piece of paper in her hand. A recipe, they think, though it wasn't her famous marmalade one. "How interesting," murmured Miss Marple. "And her cat? Has Martha been found?" "The cat?" Mrs. Billings looked momentarily puzzled. "I don't believe anyone mentioned it. Though now you speak of it, it is odd that Martha wasn't raising the alarm. That animal normally makes a dreadful fuss if anyone even approaches Mrs. Hartley." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "I think I'll call at the vicarage. The Reverend will be arranging the funeral service, I expect." At the vicarage, Miss Marple was shown into the study where Reverend Billings sat at his desk, surrounded by papers. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, rising to greet her. "I was just preparing some notes for Mrs. Hartley's service. A good woman, much respected in the parish." "Indeed," agreed Miss Marple, "though I can't help wondering about certain coincidences. The missing recipe book, and now this sudden death." The vicar looked uncomfortable. "I'm sure there's no connection. The recipe book was merely misplaced in the confusion of the fête, and Mrs. Hartley's passing, while sad, was not unexpected at her age." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple, "though in my experience coincidences often deserve closer examination. It reminds me of something that happened with the invalid Mr. Sanderson and his collection of rare stamps." The vicar listened politely to her reminiscence, though with the air of a man humouring an elderly lady's rambling. When she took her leave, Miss Marple made her way back home, taking a circuitous route that passed once more by Mrs. Hartley's cottage. The police had gone, but as she approached, she noticed something peculiar. A flash of movement in the garden next door, and a glimpse of what appeared to be a familiar tortoise-shell cat slipping through the hedge. "Martha?" she called softly, but the animal, if it was indeed Mrs. Hartley's cat, had vanished. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled in her armchair and began to arrange her thoughts methodically, just as she arranged her knitting patterns. There was the missing recipe book, the disturbed pantry, the half-written note, and now the absent cat who might have reappeared in a neighbour's garden. And there was something else, something about the way the jars were arranged that suggested a purpose beyond a simple accident. She recalled Mrs. Hartley's distress at the fête, her insistence that the recipe remain private, a family matter, and Frederick's return after so many years abroad coinciding so neatly with his aunt's death. "One sees a great deal of human nature living in a village," Miss Marple murmured to herself, "and human nature is much the same everywhere." As the afternoon light began to fade, Miss Marple came to a decision. Tomorrow would be her regular Wednesday knitting circle, and there was no better place to gather information without appearing to do so than among a group of ladies with their needles and wool. Chapter 4. The Wednesday Knitting Circle. Wednesday afternoon found Miss Marple's comfortable sitting room occupied by the familiar faces of her knitting circle. The ladies had arranged themselves in their usual positions, Mrs. Bantry in the wing-back chair near the fireplace, Miss Weatherby and Miss Hartnell sharing the sofa, and Mrs. Price perched on the edge of the small stool she insisted was better for her back. The gentle click of knitting needles provided a soothing background to their conversation, which had, inevitably, turned to the subject of Mrs. Hartley's sudden death. "Such a shock," declared Miss Weatherby, her needles working rapidly on what appeared to be a rather complicated pattern for a child's jumper. Though she was getting on in years, of course. "Dr. Crawford says it was her heart," contributed Mrs. Price. "Quite natural at her age. Still, there's something not quite right about finding her like that, all alone in her pantry." Miss Marple passed around a plate of her seed cake. "It is rather puzzling," she agreed mildly. "Mrs. Hartley was so very careful about her health, and then there's the curious business of her cat." "Her cat?" Miss Hartnell looked up from her work. "What about it?" "Martha seems to have disappeared," explained Miss Marple. "Most unlike the creature, from what I understand. Mrs. Hartley and that cat were inseparable." Mrs. Bantry nodded thoughtfully. "Animals often sense when something is wrong. After Colonel Bantry's old retriever went missing the night before his attack of pleurisy, I've always believed they have a sixth sense about such matters." "I wonder," said Miss Marple, adjusting her yarn with careful fingers, "whether Frederick Hartley will remain in the village now. I understand he stands to inherit the cottage." "So I've heard," confirmed Miss Weatherby, who, as the postmistress's sister, was generally well informed about most village matters. "Left everything to him, she did. Not that there's much besides the cottage and its contents, though I did hear from Mrs. Green that Frederick was particularly keen to locate some papers of his aunt's." Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily. "Indeed? What sort of papers, I wonder?" Miss Weatherby leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice despite the fact that they were quite alone. "Well, I shouldn't repeat it, but Mrs. Green mentioned that young Alice overheard him talking to someone on the telephone. Quite agitated he was, saying he had to find the document before anyone else did." "How very interesting," murmured Miss Marple. "And the recipe book that went missing at the fete? Has that been found?" "Not that I've heard," said Mrs. Price. "Though speaking of recipes, Mrs. Billings was asking me just yesterday about old methods of preserving documents. For her display, she said, though the fete is well over." "Documents again," observed Miss Marple. "Quite a coincidence." She turned to Mrs. Bantry. "You've met our new doctor's sister, I believe? Miss Crawford? Did she mention her work in chemistry at all?" Mrs. Bantry looked surprised at the apparent change of subject. "Only briefly. Something about industrial applications, I believe. She seemed reluctant to discuss it. Rather reserved woman altogether. I had tea with Miss Crawford last week," contributed Miss Hartnell, unexpectedly. "She mentioned something rather curious when we were discussing recipes. She asked if I'd ever heard of using marmalade as a base for invisible ink during the war. Said it was a technique used by certain operatives." A momentary silence fell over the group as each lady processed this information. Miss Marple's needles resumed their steady rhythm. "Invisible ink?" she repeated thoughtfully. How very interesting. Do you know, that reminds me of something that happened during the war. My nephew Raymond, he was in intelligence, you know, mentioned a case where important information was hidden in the most ordinary of places, a recipe card, I believe it was, belonging to a housekeeper in a prominent household. The measurements, when properly interpreted, contained coded information about naval deployments. "Surely you don't think Mrs. Hartley's marmalade recipe?" began Mrs. Price, then stopped, looking slightly embarrassed at suggesting something so dramatic. "I merely find it curious that a recipe should cause such concern," said Miss Marple mildly. Mrs. Hartley was most insistent that it remain private, a family matter, she called it. "And now, so soon after it goes missing, this tragedy occurs." Mrs. Bantry frowned. "But Inspector Slack is satisfied it was natural causes, and Dr. Crawford confirmed it was her heart." "Yes," agreed Miss Marple. Though Dr. Crawford is new to the village and would not have known Mrs. Hartley's medical history well, and there is something about the arrangement of those jars in the pantry that troubles me. The ladies looked at her expectantly, but Miss Marple merely smiled and offered more cake. The conversation gradually turned to other matters, the upcoming church flower arrangement competition, the vicar's sermon on Sunday, and Mrs. Price's daughter's engagement to a young man from Eastbourne. It was as they were preparing to leave that Miss Weatherby provided one final piece of information. "I almost forgot to mention," she said, fastening her cardigan buttons. "Frederick Hartley was asking about the London train times at the post office yesterday. Said he might need to go up on business connected with his aunt's affairs, though it seemed odd he should be thinking of such things so soon after her passing." After her guests had departed, Miss Marple stood at her garden gate, watching them make their way down the lane, her expression thoughtful. Once alone, she returned to her sitting room and drew out a small notebook from her knitting basket. In it, she began to make neat entries, organizing the facts as she knew them. Frederick Hartley had returned after years abroad, just as his aunt was preparing to enter her marmalade in the competition. The recipe book had disappeared during the fête, and now Mrs. Hartley was dead. Frederick was searching urgently for a document and planning a trip to London. Miss Crawford, with her background in chemistry, had a curious knowledge of wartime uses of marmalade as invisible ink. And Mrs. Billings showed an unusual interest in historical preservation techniques. Most intriguing of all was the information about Mrs. Hartley's past. Miss Marple recalled something Mrs. Hartley had once mentioned in passing at a church meeting, that before settling in St. Mary Mead, she had worked as a cook in a grand house. "In service with a very important family," she had said, with a certain pride. Miss Marple tapped her pencil thoughtfully on the page. If Mrs. Hartley had indeed worked in a political household during the war, as her knitting circle had suggested, and if her marmalade recipe contained coded information. "It's really very like the case of old Mr. Tumblethorpe's gardener," she murmured to herself. "Everyone thought he was merely keeping notes on the rose varieties, but in fact—" She was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Constable Wells, looking rather uncomfortable. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," he said, touching his helmet respectfully. "Inspector Slack asked me to stop by and inquire whether you might have seen Mrs. Hartley's cat. The animal's still missing, and Mr. Hartley is concerned." "How thoughtful of Frederick to be concerned about Martha at such a difficult time," remarked Miss Marple. "I did think I caught a glimpse of a tortoise-shell cat near Mrs. Hartley's garden yesterday, but I couldn't be certain it was Martha." Constable Wells nodded. "We're checking with all the neighbours. Strange for a cat to vanish like that." After he had gone, Miss Marple returned to her notebook, adding the new information. It seemed significant that Inspector Slack, who had dismissed her concerns about Mrs. Hartley's death, was now sufficiently interested to send a constable in search of the missing cat. As the evening drew in, Miss Marple made herself a light supper and continued to reflect on the puzzle. The key seemed to lie in the marmalade recipe itself. If it did indeed contain some form of code or secret information, that would explain Mrs. Hartley's protectiveness, Frederick's urgency, and possibly even Miss Crawford's interest. "What one needs," she said aloud to herself, "is to understand why a marmalade recipe from the war years would still be of interest now, and whether poor Mrs. Hartley understood what she possessed." She thought about the half-written note mentioned by Frederick. Had Mrs. Hartley been trying to record something important in her final moments? And the disturbed pantry shelves, jars moved or removed according to Alice. Miss Marple found herself wondering exactly which jars had been displaced. As she prepared for bed, Miss Marple made a decision. Tomorrow she would pay a social call to the vicarage. Mrs. Billings' interest in historical preservation techniques might be entirely innocent, connected only to her display. But if there was more to it, if she, too, had some knowledge of the importance of Mrs. Hartley's recipe, then a carefully guided conversation might yield valuable insights. "One sees such a lot of human nature in a village," Miss Marple murmured as she turned out her bedside lamp. "And human nature is much the same everywhere. People will go to extraordinary lengths to protect their secrets, even to the point of murder." But as she drifted off to sleep, Miss Marple could not have anticipated that by this time tomorrow there would be a second death in St. Mary Mead, and the case of the missing marmalade recipe would take an even darker turn. Chapter 5. Tea at the Vicarage. The following afternoon found Miss Marple making her way to the vicarage, a small basket of freshly cut roses from her garden hanging from her arm. A social call with a small gift was always the most natural way to initiate conversation, and Miss Marple had found over the years that people were remarkably forthcoming when their guard was down. The vicarage was a pleasant Georgian building set back from the lane, with a well-tended garden that Mrs. Billings had indeed transformed considerably since her arrival in the parish. Miss Marple noted with interest several new plantings of herbs that had not been there during the previous vicar's wife's tenure. She was admitted by the vicarage help, a taciturn woman named Mrs. Clement, and shown into the drawing-room where, to her surprise, she found not only Mrs. Billings, but also Frederick Hartley. They appeared to be in serious conversation, which halted abruptly at her entrance. "Miss Marple," said Mrs. Billings, rising with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "How kind of you to call, and with such lovely roses too." "I thought they might brighten your table," said Miss Marple mildly. "Good afternoon, Mr. Hartley. I trust you are managing as well as can be expected in these sad circumstances." Frederick looked somewhat ill at ease, but composed himself quickly. "Yes, thank you. The arrangements keep one occupied, of course. I've just been consulting with Mrs. Billings about the funeral service. The vicar is out visiting the Simmons family. Their youngest has measles," explained Mrs. Billings. "But I've been assisting Mr. Hartley with some of the details. Perhaps you'd join us for tea, Miss Marple?" As Mrs. Billings rang for tea, Miss Marple settled herself comfortably, observing that a large ledger-like book was open on the table between them. Catching her glance, Frederick hastily closed it. "The parish guest book," he explained. "We were checking the dates of my aunt's involvement with the church for the eulogy." "Mrs. Hartley was indeed a devoted parishioner," agreed Miss Marple. "I believe she was particularly involved with the Harvest Festival Committee over the years." Mrs. Billings nodded. "She joined many parish activities after moving here. I understand she came to St. Mary Mead shortly after the war." "In 1947, confirmed Frederick, after her service in the Fortescue household came to an end." "The Fortescues?" inquired Miss Marple innocently. "The name is familiar, but I can't quite place it." Frederick seemed to hesitate. Sir William Fortescue. He was in the Foreign Office, I believe. My aunt was their cook for many years. How interesting, murmured Miss Marple. One does hear such fascinating things in those great houses. I imagine your aunt must have had many stories. Edith was remarkably discreet, said Frederick, a certain tightness in his voice. She understood the importance of confidentiality in such positions. At that moment, Mrs. Clement entered with the tea tray, and the conversation paused as Mrs. Billings performed the duties of hostess. Miss Marple accepted her cup with thanks, noting the slight tremor in Mrs. Billings's hand as she poured. "I was so sorry to hear about the loss of your aunt's recipe book at the fete," Miss Marple said once they were settled again. "Has it been recovered yet?" Frederick shook his head. "No, and it's a great pity. That book contained all her recipes collected over a lifetime. The marmalade recipe in particular was something of a family heirloom. Mr. Hartley was telling me that it dated back to the war years," said Mrs. Billings with a brightness that seemed somewhat forced. "Developed during her time with the Fortescues, I understand." "It was indeed," said Frederick. "My aunt was rather proud of it. She mentioned that Lady Fortescue herself had requested it during a visit from some important government official. A minor diplomatic triumph, she always called it." Miss Marple smiled. "How delightful! The small pleasures of life are so important, aren't they? Though I have heard that during the war, even ordinary things could serve extraordinary purposes. My nephew Raymond once mentioned to me that even recipes could be used to convey coded information. Though that sounds rather like something from a spy novel, doesn't it?" She gave a self-deprecating little laugh, but her sharp eyes did not miss the quick glance exchanged between Frederick and Mrs. Billings. "I'm sure your nephew was exaggerating," said Mrs. Billings, setting down her cup with a slight clatter. "Though the war did produce all manner of unusual methods, I suppose. Did your aunt ever mention visitors from London in connection with her recipe?" asked Miss Marple, watching Frederick carefully. "Only I thought I saw someone at the fete who looked rather out of place, a distinguished gentleman speaking with Dr. Crawford's sister." Frederick's expression remained carefully neutral. "Not that I recall, though my aunt did mention that a man had called on her recently, inquiring about her time with the Fortescues. A historian, she thought, working on a book about the diplomatic service during the war." "How very interesting," said Miss Marple. "And did she speak with him?" "I believe she refused," said Frederick. "As I mentioned, she was quite discreet about her time in that household." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, then glanced at the guest book that Frederick had closed. A torn edge was just visible at one corner. "Oh dear," she remarked. "It looks as though a page has been removed from the book." Mrs. Billings coloured slightly. "Yes, most unfortunate. We discovered it yesterday. It seems someone has removed a page from the entries for 1946. 1946? Miss Marple's expression was one of mild surprise. "But I thought your aunt didn't come to St. Mary Mead until 1947, Mr. Hartley." For a moment Frederick looked disconcerted. "That's right," he said after a brief pause, "but she visited the village several times before moving here permanently, to look for property, you understand." "I see," said Miss Marple. "And the missing page would have recorded one of those visits?" "Presumably," said Mrs. Billings a little too quickly, "though it's impossible to be certain without the page itself." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind working. The timing seemed significant. 1946, just after the war, but before Mrs. Hartley had left the Fortescue household, and now a page recording a visit during that year had vanished from the guest book. "I understand you've been making inquiries about historical methods of document preservation, Mrs. Billings," she said, changing the subject with apparent randomness. "For your display at the fete?" Mrs. Billings looked momentarily taken aback. "Yes, though the display is over now, of course. I have a particular interest in historical documents." "As does my husband," added Frederick unexpectedly. "Which reminds me, I must catch the afternoon train to London. There are some papers at the solicitor's that require my attention." "You're going to London today?" asked Miss Marple. "How taxing for you, with the funeral arrangements to manage." "Just overnight," said Frederick. "The firm of Blackwell and Sims has handled my aunt's affairs for years. There are certain matters that cannot wait, even for bereavement." After Frederick had departed, making his excuses with barely concealed impatience, Miss Marple lingered a little longer with Mrs. Billings. Their conversation turned to more general topics: the church flower rota, plans for the harvest festival, and Mrs. Billings' herb garden. "I've been particularly successful with my herbs this year," said Mrs. Billings, visibly relaxing as the conversation moved to safer ground. "The digitalis is especially fine." "Digitalis?" inquired Miss Marple. "Foxglove, isn't it? I believe it has medicinal properties." "Indeed," agreed Mrs. Billings. "It's used in heart medicine, though the plant itself can be quite dangerous if mishandled. One must be very careful with such things." When Miss Marple finally took her leave, the afternoon was advancing toward evening. She walked slowly back through the village, considering what she had learned. The Fortescue connection seemed significant, as did the missing page from the guest book. And Frederick's sudden trip to London, coupled with Mrs. Billings' unusual interest in document preservation and potentially dangerous plants, gave her much to consider. As she passed Mrs. Hartley's cottage, she paused. A light was visible in the kitchen window, though Frederick had just left for London. Curious, Miss Marple moved closer, keeping to the shadow of the hedge. Through the window she could make out the silhouette of someone moving about, someone who, from the slender outline, was most definitely not Frederick Hartley. Chapter 6. A Visit to Thornfield Cottage. Miss Marple had always believed in the value of social niceties. In a small village like St. Mary Mead, unexpected visits could raise eyebrows, but a carefully planned call to welcome newcomers would never be questioned. And so, the following morning, she found herself walking the winding lane toward Thornfield Cottage, carrying a small pot of her homemade strawberry preserves, a suitable welcoming gift for Dr. Crawford and his sister. Thornfield Cottage stood somewhat apart from the village proper, a handsome Victorian building with a well-established garden that had fallen into slight disarray under the previous owner. Miss Marple noted that some effort had been made to restore it, though the work appeared haphazard, as if the current occupants had neither the time nor the inclination for serious gardening. She rang the bell and waited. After a moment, the door was opened by Miss Crawford herself, who looked momentarily startled at the sight of her visitor. "Miss Marple," she said, composing her features into a polite smile. "Oh, what a surprise!" "Good morning, Miss Crawford," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "I've been remiss in not formally welcoming you and your brother to our little community. I brought you some of my strawberry preserves, not quite in the same league as Mrs. Hartley's marmalade, I'm afraid, but my grandniece seems to enjoy it on her toast." Miss Crawford hesitated briefly, then stepped back. "How kind. Please, do come in. James is out on his rounds, but I was just about to have tea. Perhaps you'd join me." The interior of Thornfield Cottage was pleasantly furnished, though with an air of impermanence, as if its occupants were not yet fully settled. Miss Marple was shown into a sitting room where books were stacked rather haphazardly on shelves and tables. "You must forgive the disarray," said Miss Crawford, gesturing vaguely at the room. "We haven't had time to properly organize since moving in." "Moving is always such a disturbance," agreed Miss Marple sympathetically. "When my nephew Raymond changed his London flat, he said it took months to feel properly settled. I see you're both great readers." "Yes, James has always been a collector of books. Many of these are his medical texts, of course. Miss Marple's gaze had been drawn to a shelf where several volumes caught her attention. Not medical texts at all, but works on cryptography, historical documents, and what appeared to be wartime intelligence operations. One book in particular stood out, Covert Communications, The Secret History of Wartime Intelligence. "Your brother has wide-ranging interests beyond medicine," she observed mildly. Miss Crawford followed her gaze and moved swiftly to place herself between Miss Marple and the bookshelf. "Yes, he's always been fascinated by history, particularly the war years. I'll just fetch that tea, shall I?" While Miss Crawford was absent, Miss Marple took the opportunity to glance around the room more carefully. On a desk by the window lay a partially concealed photograph, its edge just visible beneath a stack of papers. Without disturbing the arrangement, she managed to make out enough to recognize a large country house, an imposing stone mansion set in formal gardens. When Miss Crawford returned with the tea tray, Miss Marple was seated innocently in her chair again. "Such a lovely view from your window," she remarked. "You can just see the church spire through the trees." Miss Crawford seemed distracted as she poured the tea. "Yes, it's quite pleasant." She handed Miss Marple a cup. "I understand you're a friend of Mrs. Hartley's." "Such a sad business." "Indeed," agreed Miss Marple. "Though I confess I didn't know her terribly well. She kept rather to herself, especially in recent years. I believe she worked for an important family before coming to St. Mary Mead. The Fortescues, I understand." Miss Crawford's hand trembled slightly, causing the teacup to rattle against its saucer. "Did she? I wouldn't know, of course." "Sir William Fortescue," continued Miss Marple conversationally. "In the Foreign Office, I believe. Their country estate was quite famous in its day, rather like the house in that photograph on your desk." There was a moment of tense silence. Then Miss Crawford gave a small laugh. "How observant you are! Yes, that's Fortescue Hall. James visited it once for a medical conference. The estate has been converted to a conference centre now. He was quite taken with the architecture." "How interesting," said Miss Marple. "Such coincidences do occur, don't they? Though I've always found that in life there are few true coincidences. My nephew Raymond, he was in intelligence during the war, always says that when things appear to connect, they usually do, though not always in the ways one might expect." Miss Crawford set down her cup with a decisive movement. "Miss Marple, I'm sure you didn't come here to discuss wartime intelligence operations." "Oh dear, no," said Miss Marple, with a self-deprecating smile. "I'm just a curious old woman with a tendency to ramble, though I did wonder if you had any insights into poor Mrs. Hartley's death. As a chemist, you might understand better than most what could cause symptoms that might be mistaken for a heart attack." The atmosphere in the room seemed to chill perceptibly. "I believe my brother was quite clear in his diagnosis," said Miss Crawford stiffly. "Mrs. Hartley died of natural causes, a heart attack, as one might expect in a woman of her age." "Of course," agreed Miss Marple. "Though certain substances, digitalis for instance, can produce very similar symptoms. Mrs. Billings was showing me her herb garden just yesterday, and her foxgloves are particularly fine this year." Miss Crawford's expression remained carefully neutral. "I'm sure Mrs. Billings's gardening skills are admirable, but I fail to see the relevance." "Merely an observation," said Miss Marple mildly. "I've always found gardening so revealing of character. What we choose to grow often reflects aspects of ourselves we might not otherwise display." She paused, then added, "I understand you have an interest in marmalade recipes, particularly those that might have been used for invisible ink during the war." The change in Miss Crawford was subtle but unmistakable, a slight stiffening of her posture, a tightening around the eyes. "Who told you that?" "Oh, it was mentioned at my knitting circle," said Miss Marple, vaguely. "Such an ingenious method, using ordinary household items for extraordinary purposes. Rather like Mrs. Hartley's recipe book, perhaps. Miss Crawford stood abruptly. "I think you should leave now, Miss Marple. I have an appointment in the village shortly, and I'm sure you have other calls to make." As Miss Marple was shown to the door, she noticed a small calendar on the hall table with that day's date circled in red and a notation: London Archives, 2 p.m. Beside it lay a train timetable with Thornfield Cottage's address written in the margin, the same detail Miss Weatherby had mentioned seeing in Frederick's possession. Outside again in the lane, Miss Marple paused to arrange her shawl, her mind working rapidly. Dr. Crawford's sister was clearly disturbed by the mention of the Fortescues and the Marmalade recipe, the books on cryptography and wartime intelligence, the photograph of Fortescue Hall, and now the planned visit to the London Archives, all suggested a connection to Mrs. Hartley's past that went beyond mere coincidence. As she walked back toward the village, Miss Marple caught sight of a familiar figure ahead, Frederick Hartley, who had supposedly left for London the previous afternoon. He was walking briskly toward his aunt's cottage, and even from a distance his manner suggested urgency. Miss Marple altered her course slightly, taking the longer route through the churchyard to avoid being seen. As she passed by the cemetery, she noticed with interest that someone had placed fresh flowers on a grave, not a recent one, but a simple marker dating from 1946. The name on the headstone was unfamiliar to her. Margaret Wilson, faithful servant, 1898 to 1946. By the time she reached home, Miss Marple had come to a decision. If Frederick Hartley was indeed searching for a document of some importance, and if the London Archives figured in both his plans and Miss Crawford's, then perhaps the answers lay in Mrs. Hartley's past connection to the Fortescues. And if Miss Crawford was planning to visit the archives that very afternoon, then time might be of the essence. She would need to speak with Inspector Slack, however reluctant he might be to listen to what he would undoubtedly consider the ramblings of an elderly spinster. But before that, there was one more piece of information she needed, and for that she would need to examine the church records regarding the mysterious Margaret Wilson, who had died the very year that Edith Hartley had visited St. Mary Mead for the first time. Little did Miss Marple know that by the following morning Frederick Hartley would be found dead in his aunt's cottage, and the case of the missing marmalade recipe would take an even darker turn. Chapter 7. The Second Death. The following morning dawned grey and misty, a common enough occurrence in an English autumn. Miss Marple was just finishing her breakfast when the shrill ring of the telephone disturbed the quiet of her cottage. It was Mrs. Bantry, her voice high with excitement and distress. "Jane, have you heard? It's Frederick Hartley, found dead this morning in his aunt's cottage." Miss Marple set down her teacup carefully. "Dead? How dreadful! What happened?" "They're saying suicide. A note was found beside him, something about remorse and inability to live with his actions. The poor man apparently took poison. Mr. Higgins, the gardener, found him when he went to tend to Mrs. Hartley's roses. The police are there now." After assuring Mrs. Bantry that she would call later for more details, Miss Marple put on her coat and hat. If Frederick Hartley's death was indeed suicide, it suggested he had been responsible for his aunt's death, and yet something about this neat solution troubled her. She recalled his manner the previous day at the vicarage, his urgency about going to London. A man planning suicide doesn't typically concern himself with visiting solicitors and archives. By the time she reached Mrs. Hartley's cottage, a small crowd had gathered, held back by Constable Wells. Inspector Slack's car was parked in front, and Dr. Crawford's bicycle leaned against the garden wall. "I'm afraid you can't come any closer, Miss Marple," said Constable Wells, looking uncomfortable. "Inspector's orders." "I quite understand," said Miss Marple mildly. Such a tragedy coming so soon after poor Mrs. Hartley's death. Was it definitely suicide? The constable shifted uneasily. Seems that way. Left a note confessing to causing his aunt's death. Remorse, they're saying. Miss Marple was about to reply when Inspector Slack emerged from the cottage, his expression characteristically grim. He noticed her immediately and frowned. Miss Marple, I might have known you'd be here. This is a police matter, and I must ask you to return home immediately. Of course, Inspector, she agreed placidly. I was merely taking my morning walk when I heard the news. So very sad. I understand Mr. Hartley left a note. Inspector Slack's frown deepened. That information is not for public consumption, though I suppose everyone in the village will know by lunchtime anyway. Yes, he left a note suggesting he was responsible for his aunt's death and couldn't live with the guilt. How very interesting, murmured Miss Marple. The handwriting. Was it definitely his? Only I happened to notice yesterday, at the vicarage, that Mr. Hartley wrote with his left hand, which often gives a distinctive character to the writing. Something flickered in Inspector Slack's eyes. The note is being examined, of course. Standard procedure. Dr. Crawford emerged from the cottage at that moment, looking grave. Seeing Miss Marple, he paused, his expression guarded. Dr. Crawford, she greeted him. Such a sad business. Was it poison, do you think? It appears so, he replied stiffly, though the exact substance will need to be determined by toxicology. One does wonder where he might have obtained such a thing, Miss Marple remarked innocently, though I suppose with his travels abroad. I really couldn't say, said the doctor, a little too quickly. Now, if you'll excuse me, I must return to my surgery. Inspector, I'll send over my report this afternoon. As Dr. Crawford cycled away, Miss Marple noticed something fall from his pocket, a small slip of paper that fluttered to the ground unnoticed. Once the doctor had disappeared around the corner, she casually stepped forward and retrieved it, slipping it into her bag without examining it. Miss Marple, said Inspector Slack firmly, I must insist that you leave the investigation to the police. Oh, I wouldn't dream of interfering, she assured him. Though I did happen to see Mr. Hartley yesterday at the vicarage, discussing his aunt's affairs with Mrs. Billings, he mentioned he was catching the afternoon train to London to visit his aunt's solicitors, Blackwell and Sims. Perhaps they might shed some light on his state of mind. Inspector Slack's expression suggested he found this information both useful and irritating. We'll look into it. Now please return home and leave us to our work. Instead of going home, however, Miss Marple made her way to the police station, where she asked to speak with Inspector Slack's superior, Inspector Craddock, whom she had assisted on previous occasions. When shown into his office, she came directly to the point. Inspector, I believe there are serious inconsistencies in Frederick Hartley's apparent suicide. I saw him yesterday at the vicarage, making definite plans to visit London. He seemed urgent about it, but not despairing or guilty. And there's the matter of his belongings. Inspector Craddock, who had learned to respect Miss Marple's insights, leaned forward. What about his belongings? Has anyone examined what he brought back from London? He must have returned late yesterday, as I saw him in the village in the afternoon. I believe he visited the London archives and may have discovered something important. A search of Frederick's belongings yielded several significant items. A newspaper clipping about wartime espionage, specifically mentioning Sir William Fortescue's household being suspected of harbouring a German agent. A handwritten note with what appeared to be a partial recipe, and a train timetable with Thornfield Cottage's address written in the margin, exactly as Miss Weatherby had mentioned. Most interesting, murmured Miss Marple, when Inspector Craddock shared these findings with her. And the suicide note, may I see it? The note was brief. I cannot live with what I've done. Aunt Edith discovered my true purpose in returning and threatened exposure. Forgive me. The handwriting, as Miss Marple had suspected, showed none of the characteristics of a left-handed writer. "This was not written by Frederick Hartley," she stated firmly. "It's a forgery, and not a particularly convincing one." Inspector Craddock frowned. "You're suggesting murder disguised as suicide?" "Precisely. And I believe it connects directly to Mrs. Hartley's death, which was also murder, not a heart attack. Both deaths revolve around that marmalade recipe, or rather, what it concealed." Miss Marple then shared her theory that Mrs. Hartley's famous marmalade recipe contained a coded record of wartime communications she had overheard while working in the Fortescue household. The recipe itself was merely the medium for a code, measurements and ingredients that, when properly interpreted, revealed something that remained dangerous even decades later. "It explains everything," she concluded. Mrs. Hartley's insistence on keeping the recipe private, Frederick's urgency to find the document, Miss Crawford's interest in invisible ink techniques, and Mrs. Billings's questions about document preservation. They all sought the same thing, the information hidden in that recipe. Inspector Craddock considered her theory. But who killed Frederick? And why now, after all these years? "I believe Frederick discovered the truth yesterday in London. He may have learned not only what the recipe contained, but who was involved. As for why now, perhaps because someone realized that Mrs. Hartley, in her advancing years, might not fully understand the importance of what she possessed." The inspector studied the items from Frederick's belongings again. "This address, Thornfield Cottage, that's where the new doctor lives, isn't it? With his sister?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, and I believe Miss Crawford is not who she claims to be. The paper that fell from Dr. Crawford's pocket this morning," she withdrew it from her bag. "It's a receipt from the London Archives, dated yesterday, for research on Foreign Office communications during 1944 to 46. Inspector Craddock's expression hardened. "I think it's time we paid a visit to Thornfield Cottage." But as they prepared to leave, a constable burst in with urgent news. Dr. Crawford and his sister had been seen boarding the morning train to London, carrying substantial luggage, clearly with no intention of returning. "We'll need to alert Scotland Yard," said Inspector Craddock grimly. "But first, I want to hear everything you know about this case, Miss Marple, from the beginning." As Miss Marple laid out the facts and her deductions, a clearer picture emerged. The recipe book had been stolen not for its culinary value, but for the secrets it contained, secrets that implicated several prominent figures in treasonous activities during the war. Mrs. Hartley had been killed when she realized the true importance of her recipe and the danger it posed. Frederick, pursuing his own investigation into his aunt's death, had discovered the truth in the London Archives, only to become the second victim of someone determined to keep the past buried. By evening, telegrams from London confirmed that Dr. Crawford and his sister had been apprehended attempting to board a ship for France. In their possession was a small, water-stained recipe card for marmalade with seemingly innocent measurements and instructions that, when properly decoded, told a very different story, one that would soon send shockwaves through the highest levels of British society. Chapter 8. Marmalade and Secrets. 3 days after Frederick Hartley's body had been discovered, Miss Marple invited several people to tea at her cottage. The small sitting room was arranged with her usual attention to detail. Fresh flowers from her garden adorned the mantelpiece, her best china was laid out on the table, and a plate of scones sat alongside a pot of her own strawberry preserves. Inspector Craddock had agreed, somewhat reluctantly, to her proposal for this gathering. He sat now in the armchair by the window, his official notebook discreetly placed beside him. Mrs. Bantry occupied the seat opposite, her keen eyes missing nothing. The vicar and Mrs. Billings shared the small sofa, both looking somewhat uncomfortable, while Constable Wells stood near the door, as if unsure whether he was present in an official capacity or as a guest. "Thank you all for coming," said Miss Marple, pouring tea with a steady hand. "Inspector Craddock has kindly allowed me to share what we have discovered about the deaths of Mrs. Hartley and her nephew Frederick. I believe it may help us all to understand these tragic events." She passed the cups around, the familiar ritual providing a momentary comfort against the gravity of what was to follow. The case began, as you know, with the disappearance of Mrs. Hartley's recipe book during the village fete. At the time it seemed merely unfortunate, the loss of a family heirloom. But it was, in fact, the first move in a deadly game that had its roots not in our peaceful village, but in the dangerous world of wartime espionage. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eagerly. "Espionage in St. Mary Mead." "Not in St. Mary Mead precisely," corrected Miss Marple gently, "but in the household where Mrs. Hartley worked before coming here, Fortescue Hall, the home of Sir William Fortescue, a senior figure in the Foreign Office during the war." The vicar frowned. "I fail to see how a recipe book could be connected to espionage." "Ah," said Miss Marple, "but this was no ordinary recipe book. The Marmalade recipe in particular contained something far more valuable than culinary instructions. Mrs. Hartley had unwittingly become the keeper of a dangerous secret." She took a small sip of tea before continuing. During her time at Fortescue Hall, Mrs. Hartley, then Miss Edith Wilson, had a younger sister, Margaret, who also worked in the household as a parlour maid. Margaret's duties gave her access to many of the meetings and conversations that took place among Sir William's distinguished guests. "The grave in the churchyard," murmured Mrs. Billings. "Margaret Wilson died 1946. Miss Marple nodded. "Precisely. Margaret Wilson died under mysterious circumstances just after the war ended. The official cause was pneumonia, but the truth, as Inspector Craddock has now confirmed, was far more sinister." Inspector Craddock cleared his throat. "We've obtained records indicating that Margaret Wilson was suspected of being a German agent, but died before she could be officially questioned." "But she wasn't a German agent," continued Miss Marple. "She was something potentially more troubling. A witness to treasonous conversations among certain high-ranking officials who frequented Fortescue Hall. She had been secretly documenting these conversations, encoding them within her sister's marmalade recipe. The measurements, ingredients, and preparation instructions, when properly decoded, revealed damning evidence against several prominent figures." Mrs. Bantry gasped. "So Mrs. Hartley knew about this?" "Initially, no," said Miss Marple. "Margaret gave the recipe to her sister for safekeeping shortly before her death, saying only that it was important and should be preserved exactly as written. Mrs. Hartley, not understanding its true significance, kept it as a family treasure and eventually became known in our village for the marmalade itself." The vicar looked troubled. "But after all these years, surely those wartime indiscretions would be of little importance now." "That would depend on the nature of the indiscretions, wouldn't it?" suggested Miss Marple mildly. "Some actions might be merely embarrassing if revealed decades later. Others might still constitute treason with no statute of limitations, and for those who had risen to positions of significant power since the war, even the suggestion of past treachery could be devastating." "The Crawfords," said Mrs. Billings suddenly. "They weren't really brother and sister, were they?" Inspector Craddock shook his head. "No, the man calling himself Dr. James Crawford has been identified as Jonathan Mills, formerly of MI5. The woman was Diana Mills, his wife, not his sister. They were sent to St. Mary Mead with a specific mission to locate and destroy Mrs. Hartley's recipe before its significance could be discovered." "But why now, after all these years?" asked Mrs. Bantry. "Because of Frederick Hartley," explained Miss Marple. He had recently been approached by a historian researching wartime intelligence operations. This historian had uncovered references to encoded information hidden by a housemaid at Fortescue Hall, though he didn't know the specific nature of the code. When Frederick learned of this, he contacted his aunt, intending to assess the value of what she possessed. "So Frederick wasn't involved in his aunt's death?" asked the vicar. "No," said Miss Marple firmly. Frederick was genuinely trying to understand what had happened to his great-aunt Margaret all those years ago. He suspected the marmalade recipe might be valuable, but didn't realize how dangerous that knowledge would prove to be. She refilled the teacups before continuing. The Mills were alerted to Frederick's inquiries through their intelligence connections. They established themselves in St. Mary Mead, using the doctor's position to gain Mrs. Hartley's trust. When they learned she was planning to enter her marmalade in the village fete, they realized the recipe book would be temporarily accessible. "So they stole it during the commotion at the fete," said Mrs. Bantry. "Diana Mills did, yes, but Mrs. Hartley had made a separate copy of the marmalade recipe, which she kept in her pantry. When she returned home after the fete and found Martha the cat missing, taken temporarily by the Mills to prevent the animal from creating a disturbance, she grew suspicious. She began to remember things her sister had told her years ago about the recipe's importance. Inspector Craddock picked up the narrative. The Mills realized Mrs. Hartley was becoming dangerous. They visited her home, ostensibly to check on her health. Diana Mills poisoned her with digitalis from Mrs. Billings's garden, arranging the scene to suggest a heart attack. As the local doctor, Jonathan Mills was able to certify the death as natural causes. "But they still didn't have the recipe," said the vicar. "No," agreed Miss Marple. "Mrs. Hartley had hidden the copy. Frederick, meanwhile, had gone to London to investigate the Fortescue connection at the archives. There he discovered documents suggesting his great-aunt Margaret had been silenced to protect powerful people. He returned to St. Mary Mead, intending to search his aunt's cottage thoroughly, but the Mills were watching. They followed him, confronted him about his discoveries, and when he refused to cooperate, they killed him as well, staging it as a suicide." "How perfectly dreadful," murmured Mrs. Bantry. "Indeed," said Miss Marple, "but they made several mistakes. The handwriting on the suicide note didn't match Frederick's left-handed script. The timing of his suicide contradicted his clearly documented plans, and most tellingly, they overlooked one crucial hiding place." She rose and moved to a small side table, where a familiar tortoiseshell cat lay curled in a basket. "Martha returned home after Mrs. Hartley's death, as cats often do. When I found her in the garden next door, I noticed something unusual about her collar. It seemed slightly thicker than normal. Sewn into the lining was a small piece of paper, the actual marmalade recipe, with its coded messages intact." Inspector Craddock nodded. "The Mills have confessed under questioning. They were working to protect several highly placed individuals whose wartime activities, if revealed, would cause a significant political scandal even today." "And Mrs. Billings?" asked Mrs. Bantry, glancing at the vicar's wife, who had remained unusually silent. "Mrs. Billings was innocently involved," said Miss Marple kindly. "Her interest in historical preservation was genuine, though the Mills manipulated that interest to gather information. The digitalis from her garden was taken without her knowledge." Mrs. Billings looked relieved. "I had no idea my plants had been used in such a way. It's horrifying to think of." As the gathering drew to a close, Mrs. Bantry remained behind to help Miss Marple clear away the tea things. "You know, Jane," she said thoughtfully, "it's remarkable how a simple marmalade recipe could contain such secrets. One never really knows what lies beneath the surface of ordinary things, does one?" Miss Marple smiled as she carefully returned her best teacups to their shelf. "Human nature is much the same everywhere, my dear. We all have our secrets. some more dangerous than others. Mrs. Hartley's marmalade won prizes for its distinctive flavour, but its true value lay in what couldn't be tasted, only decoded. She glanced out the window to where Martha sat now on the garden wall, grooming herself in the afternoon sunlight, the mysteries of Fortescue Hall and wartime treachery forever put to rest, like the recipe that had, at last, revealed its final secret.